Day 691 of the Trump administration, and tonight the president is speaking out about the growing legal troubles now threatening his White House. Trump spoke to Reuters news agency late today in an interview right there in the Oval Office. He said he's not concerned about being impeached, and he explained why. Quote, "It's hard to impeach somebody who hasn't done anything wrong and who's created the greatest economy in the history of our country. I think that the people would revolt if that happened." Trump also spoke about the revelations about Russians and their efforts to work with people in his inner circle. Quoting Reuters again, asked about prosecutors' assertions that a number of people who had worked with him, for him, or had business dealings with Russians before and during his 2016 presidential campaign, Trump said, "The stuff you're talking about is peanut stuff." He then brought up his 2016 opponent. "I haven't heard this, but I can only tell you this. Hillary Clinton, her husband got money. She got money. She paid money. Why doesn't somebody talk about that?" Trump also had a lot to say about his former personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, who's scheduled to be sentenced to prison tomorrow. Cohen pleaded guilty to several charges, as you may recall, including campaign finance violations related to hush money payments he made to two women ahead of the election. Federal prosecutors say the payments were directed by Trump to cover up his affairs with those women. Trump told Reuters those payments did not violate campaign finance laws. He said his former attorney should have known the rules. Quote, "Michael Cohen is a lawyer. I assume he would know what he's doing," Trump said when asked if he discussed campaign finance laws with Cohen. Number one, it wasn't a campaign contribution. If it were, it's only civil. And even if it's only civil, there is no violation based on what we did, okay? Earlier this evening, former U.S. Acting Solicitor General Neal Katyal offered this rebuttal to Trump's explanation.
First, he said there was no payment, there was no payment. Now he's caught red-handed, there's a payment. So now it's not illegal. But as the memo from the Southern District New York prosecutors last Friday said, and these are career prosecutors, this is not Mueller's team, it's a felony, and it's really hard to come out with any other conclusion. The timing is the thing that's the really big deal. This is right before the election, just a few days before, particularly with the Stormy Daniels payments. And in one way of thinking about it, this is the most significant campaign contribution ever in the history of the United States. I mean, these two contributions very well may have swung the election.
So there is that to consider. And just within the past few hours, lawyers for the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn have filed papers of their own prior to his sentencing date next week. You may recall that last week the Mueller team recommended little or no jail time for Flynn. They cited his help with the Russia investigation. Flynn started cooperating last year after pleading guilty to lying to the FBI about contacts with Russians. Flynn lawyers are now asking for, quote, a term of probation not to exceed 1 year with minimal conditions of supervision, along with 200 hours of community service. They also wrote, as the government states, his early decision to plead guilty and cooperate likely affected the decisions of related firsthand witnesses to be forthcoming within the special counsel's office and cooperate. There is also news tonight about Paul Manafort. A judge says Mueller prosecutors must offer more information about the alleged lies that Manafort told that led the feds to shred his cooperation deal. That case, what you need to know, has now been pushed to early January. And on this busy Tuesday night, let's bring in our leadoff panel. Julia Ainsley, NBC News national security and justice reporter. Mimi Rocah, former assistant U.S. attorney in all places. The Southern District of New York, where have we heard that? Now a distinguished fellow in criminal justice at the Pace University School of Law. Robert Costa, national political reporter for the Washington Post, moderator of Washington Week on PBS. And Sam Stein back with us, politics editor for the Daily Beast. Good evening and welcome to you all. Because it's most recent, Mimi, I'd like to begin with you on this Flynn filing by his lawyers. They write a little section in there that when the FBI was going over to the White House to talk to Flynn, in their telling, Flynn may not have had the warning repeated to him that a lot of folks go around knowing that it's a crime to lie to the feds.
Right. So it's interesting, actually. What they actually say in the memo is that he wasn't warned about the penalties of lying to the FBI. So it's not entirely clear to me whether they're saying they didn't tell him it was a crime or they didn't tell him how much trouble he could be in. But that argument really doesn't go very far. I mean, this is, the former director of national intelligence. I mean, he's a military man. I mean, as you say, most people on the street would know it's a crime to lie to the FBI. And also, in defense of the FBI, will say this was a counterintelligence investigation at this point. I mean, they were trying to figure out what were the Russians doing talking to Flynn? What was Flynn doing talking to them? And what else is going on? And, you've had many people in the FBI who have testified about how the investigation began. And that was their main focus at that moment. So it wasn't, hey, let's see what criminal acts, Flynn has committed. But the real, sort of crux of this is Flynn has now pled guilty. He was caught red-handed lying. I mean, that's very clear. He's not debating that. He's trying to sort of appeal to the sympathies of the judge with that argument.
But the upside is it does count how much you cooperate, how enthusiastic you are. Do you bring others into the circle of Team America?
Absolutely. And in those, Flynn gets an A+ in those categories. I mean, he, first of all, as he says, as everyone has said, including the special counsel, he cooperated early, and he seems to have cooperated fully, right? I mean, he put 2 feet in the door. We have, Manafort, who went in and out. We have Cohn, who seems to have had 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out. Flynn jumped in. He gave them documents, he says. He gave them electronic evidence. This is all very intriguing to know what's in those. And he met with them 19 times. Yeah. That's not just about one phone call. That's how much trouble the president is in and people around him and whoever was involved in what was behind that phone call. Why were they talking about sanctions and what was on the other side of perhaps a discussion about relieving sanctions? What else? What were the Trump people getting out of it? And I think that's what 19, sessions could be spent talking about.
So, Julia, you hear the creak of that door the counselor just opened. It goes to point central, which you and so many others have been trying to run down, motive. Why did Flynn lie to the FBI? Are we any closer tonight to knowing that?
Well, I think what's clear here is that the prosecution is trying to get into so many different conversations that Flynn had with the administration. And part of that motive might be, was he counseled before he had those conversations with the FBI? Did he tell anyone? Did he tell then White House counsel Don McGahn? Did he tell the president himself or chief of staff that he was going to have these conversations? And did they counsel him on how to answer? It seems from what we got tonight, these 170 pages I have in front of me here, that they are trying to show that this was just a really casual conversation. They're leaving out whether or not he was counseled. But we can bet that through 19 conversations with Flynn, that's there. Another thing that jumped out to me, Brian, is trying to figure out, why you would have anything this thick. Why would they need all of that to respond when Mueller's team isn't asking for sentencing? I mean, they actually want the judge to go easy on Flynn as compared to some of these other witnesses who haven't been fully cooperative. And it seems clear it's because they know the judge they're dealing with. That Judge Sullivan is known sometimes to be wildly independent, who wouldn't necessarily follow the advice of prosecution and not incarcerate someone just because the prosecution says not to. So they're going into his character. There's a piece here I just flipped to where they talk about something Michael Flynn did when he was 13 years old and saved 2 children from a free-rolling car. I mean, things that seem to have nothing to do with this, but they're trying to build the character of a man. But it is difficult to get away from the other things we know about Michael Flynn, and in particular, an investigation that is ongoing in the Eastern District of Virginia about his dealings with Turkey.
You touch on an interesting issue, which is my long-held contention. We all should have bought stock in toner companies before this case started. We'd all be on an island in the Caribbean by now. Julia, to quickly switch gears to where you were when I last saw you outdoors this afternoon outside the Manafort matter. What did you witness in court?
It was interesting, Brian. It was just 30 minutes, a pretty quick scheduling conference. I talked to Manafort's lawyer, Kevin Downing, on the way in. He said, I don't expect much news from this. This will be routine. But what was not routine and what was unusual about it is that the defense wasn't ready to say whether or not they agreed with that scathing filing last Friday from Mueller's legal team that said that Manafort had committed crimes and lies that put him in breach of their plea agreement, that he lied about his conversations with the White House and with Russians this year. This isn't before he was charged. It was during the middle of that. And so they aren't even sure whether they agree with that or not. They may not even push back against it. And now they have until January 7th, which is a much longer timeline than we were expecting, in order to figure out what kind of evidence the prosecution has and to talk with their client, which raises questions. Has their client, Paul Manafort, been completely forthcoming with them?
Okay, Mr. Costa, on the eve of the Cohen sentencing, and let's remember, in keeping with custom, I believe Cohen will be given the chance to stand and speak for himself tomorrow in federal court. Here's the president dismissing these payments as a civil matter. I'm 4 feet away from a former Fed who would say she's not having it. It's a felony, what you're talking about. Does anyone in that White House, do you think, agree with Donald Trump?
At this point, people inside of this White House are concerned about the Mueller report, which they don't know much about. And with regard to Cohen and the association with a possible felony, as we saw in the sentencing document, they believe House Democrats are now not just a foil, they're a counterweight in the power of Washington, and that House Democrats could use that fact, that part of the sentencing memo, to begin impeachment proceedings at some point in 2019. Of course, they're going to continue to investigate Russian interference in the election, but this puts the president in a tough, not only legal position, but political position as House Democrats are about to take power. That's what Emmett Flood in the White House counsel's office is focused on as much as Robert Mueller.
And Sam, you are traditionally my take a step back guy. And in that role, let me proffer this. Take a step back. The president was asked about his own impeachment today and answered the question. What does that say?
A lot, actually. Democrats have not even taken over the House, so they haven't begun proceedings. But already we're at the point where Trump is talking about the possibility. Now, to be generous to Trump, there is certain political upside for him and his team to constantly evoke the possibility of impeachment, if only to keep the base engaged. But on the flip side, as Robert was just saying, as Bob was just saying, we don't have the Mueller report. We've had dribs and drabs. We've had some filings that hint at where they're going, but we have nothing evident from the Mueller report in terms of its finality. We don't have the finality to what Cohen was talking about and what the SDNY is looking into. We haven't even begun congressional investigations, and the Senate intelligence investigation into Russian meddling hasn't concluded either. So if Trump is at this juncture openly talking about the prospects of impeachment before any of these real investigative findings have been produced publicly, then he is in for 2 years of utter political hell. And we could be in a situation in which, in fact, the Democratic base is pushing the party to go far further than party leadership is willing to go.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.